I'd like to introduce you guys to JQ. I have no idea how to pronounce your last name. Oeswein. I was so wrong. I'm just going to keep calling him JQ for that reason, but he's going to tell us all about World War II history here on the coast side.
All right, well, I'd like to thank Liane and the other organizers for inviting me to speak today. This is a topic that I'm kind of really excited about. It's like something that I got involved in, actually not that long ago, just a few years ago. I've always been interested in history, but the coastside history, especially with regard to the military, is something that is really fascinating to me, and I continue to learn more. So I'm really happy to present this today and share this information. So let me get started. So as we all know, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. entered World War II, and our nation was rapidly mobilized in preparation for a two-front war. To protect the West Coast from any attack, the Army established the harbor defenses of San Francisco. This was headquartered at Presidio's Fort Winfield Scott, which on this map is shown right here. Okay, and the main purpose of this particular facility was to oversee several San Francisco military posts, and they were responsible for defending against naval attacks, beach assaults, and also protecting enemy ships, or sorry, for friendly ships in their waters. So the jurisdiction protected a 60-mile span of coastline beginning north of Point Reyes and ending south of Half Moon Bay. So the military actually rapidly occupied and adapted many civilian facilities along the entire West Coast for military use. They also built many new facilities and fortifications for training and defense. So here are some of the military facilities that were in the local area. The Army took over and occupied some local businesses and even a school to set up camps and operating posts. So that the beaches also were generally closed to the public and heavily patrolled by the Coast Guard. The rapid occupation and takeover by the military was obviously a major disruption to people's everyday lives, especially here on our then sparsely populated coast. And although most Americans felt a patriotic duty to adapt, many of the changes came at a great cost, and to some people, a lot more than others. Executive Order 9066, the rule signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, resulted in forcibly evacuating 120,000 Americans of Japanese background from their homes on the West Coast to barbed wire encircled camps. This order not only allowed the government to arrest and imprison enemy aliens without charge or trial, it meant their homes and businesses could be summarily seized. Just as swiftly, the U.S. government began to distribute xenophobic war propaganda that placed the Japanese at the top of America's list of enemies. Using offensive racial stereotypes, this propaganda, which permeated American media throughout the war, was used to alienate and vilify the Japanese as a whole. The Western Defense Command General, General John L. DeWitt, classified Japanese and Japanese Americans alike as, quote, an enemy race. It would be the only moment in U.S. history when the federal government effectively nullified citizenship on the grounds of racial difference. So Roosevelt's executive order also called for the compulsory relocation of more than 10,000 Italian Americans and restricted the movements of more than 600,000 Italian Americans nationwide. Many German Americans were also detained and investigated. A few thousand were interred, but most were evicted from coastal areas, including here. Detention camps were set up quickly around the country. Camps were typically overcrowded, with inadequate heating and cooling and ventilation, poor sanitation, and substandard medical care. Some families were separated. The experience was dehumanizing, to say the least. The Sharp Park detention camp, or Camp Sharpmark, which is shown here, housed 1,200 detainees, including Japanese, Germans, and Italians, and it even included some Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese nationals. Not really sure why. Locally, the Japanese, Italian, and German immigrants who were not interred were forced to surrender their guns and radios, keep to a strict evening curfew, and were forbidden from crossing to the west side of what is now Highway 1. In addition to overt racism, fear, and paranoia, regarding immigrants gripped the populace and further fueled xenophobia and discrimination. Suspicious citizens often suspected their Japanese, German, or Italian-American neighbors of espionage or subversive activity. Such suspicions often resulted in unfounded charges, detention, and internment. It's important to note, though, that no person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States was ever convicted of any serious act of espionage or sabotage during the war. And as previously mentioned, the military had built many new facilities and fortifications along the entire West Coast for training and defense. And to meet the rapid demand for these facilities, the military designed standard building plans for quickly constructed wood-frame barracks, latrines, mess halls, offices, and recreation buildings for military posts all across the country. World War II barracks buildings were constructed at an incredible pace, usually within 2 or 3 hours, because they had it's made possible by prefabricated materials and a surplus of labor resources. In fact, construction crews at Fort Ord, California, or down in Monterey, boasted their ability to finish a building every 54 minutes. That's pretty fast. And Fort Cronkite, which is shown in the upper left photo up here, was a prototypical example of these types of buildings. So in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about the Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center, which coincidentally was right here next to us. So the Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center was a top secret facility operated by the U.S. Navy during World War II. It was located here at Point Montara and also Farallon Heights, which is a block right across the highway in Moss Beach. It contained 48 semi-permanent structures, housed over 1,500 men, trained over 320,000 Navy sailors and merchant marines on the latest technology in anti-aircraft weapons. And they were also progressive in their use of women's Air Force service pilots and radio-controlled drones for live-fire training. So in today's presentation, I want to discuss the location and layout of the facility's buildings, present several historic photographs, discuss the progressive role of women's Air Force service pilots, and the military's first use of drone aircraft at this facility, and also highlight the advanced weapons and training that were used there. So this map from 1944. It's difficult to see in detail, but it shows the entire facility. It was opened as part of the U.S. Navy's 12th District in January 1942, and as of June 1945, it had 48 semi-permanent structures. It was located at Point Montara and Farallon Heights in Moss Beach. Note the Point Montara Lighthouse right here, where we are. Okay. And also there's a lot of these buildings, a lot of building foundations are still present in both of these areas. Also note the former railroad bed, which is now Highway 1, and the state highway at that time, which is where Carlo Street is now. So I'm going to talk about both sides of this facility separately, beginning with the Farallon Heights portion, this eastern portion over here. Okay. So 18 structures of the training center were on Farallon Heights. This is an 11-acre bluff in Moss Beach. It's currently bordered by 16th Street on the north, which is out of view at the top of this map. Carlo Street on the left side, as you can see here, which was the state highway at the time. Sierra Street on the south, and Lincoln Street on the east. So this secret facility was surrounded by high fences on all sides, including those on either side of the state highway that ran through it. Most of the barracks were here. There were 7 barracks, a drone hangar, and a large subsistence building. The drone hangar, which is indicated here as a TDD hangar, was really quite significant, and I'll talk about that a little later. Among the reasons this facility is not well known today is, aside from the sparse population of the coastside at the time, is that it was a top secret facility, and also it wasn't declassified until 1959, well after most of the buildings were already gone. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about, again, the two sides of the facility. And then also, I wanted to point out the gated entrance right here. And there's still, you'll notice if you go down Carlo Street, you'll still see where that gated entrance was. There was also a pedestrian bridge over the highway, so you have fences on either side, so the men could freely travel from one side of the facility to the other. It was highly restricted at that time, nobody else could go there. So many of these building foundations are still there today, and most of the drill field, most of the flat area at the very top, if you go up there, is still there as well. So this is one of the only known photographs of the Farallon Heights portion of the facility. It's apparently taken from the drill field looking west, and it primarily shows the subsistence building, which was the largest building on the site, and this served as the mess hall or cafeteria, the food storage locker, and the cook's quarters. It served, for this particular building, served, 1,500 men stationed there, and as many as 3,000 men on site on any given day. It would have served several thousand meals a day out of the subsistence building. And also of note, in the background, you'll see the radio compass station, which is still present today. It's home of the Montara Water and Sanitary District. Okay. So this is the other side of the facility, the side that we're on now, the Point Montara Bluff section. And this particular section, there were 25 buildings located here for this military operation, as well as the gun mounts. All the gun mounts were located here. There were 44 guns. So the other buildings here included the administration building, which is shown down in this corner. And in fact, right outside, you can see the foundation. There's a picnic area out here. That concrete foundation is the foundation from that administration building. So that part is still there. And so the pump house, the paint locker, let me point that out. So here's the pump house and a paint locker, and this magazine, #1, where is it? Down here. These buildings are all still here, and they're used by the Montara Water Sanitary, by the Lighthouse Hospital here for storage. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of sailors that were trained here. Hundreds of thousands of sailors that were trained here over those years, and some of the most advanced weapon systems available. Anti-aircraft drills were conducted with live ammunition using the 44 guns that were mounted on these bluffs. The trainees would fire at towed targets or radio-controlled drone aircraft. The coastside was chosen for this training due to its sparse population, where secrecy could be more easily maintained, and where it was less likely that an accident would injure or kill a civilian. So target sleeves, let me go back for a second. I wanted to show you this, this X right here is the spot where this next well-known photograph is taken. I think a lot of you have probably seen this. Okay, so target sleeves were actually towed by women Air Force service pilots. They used modified airplanes that were considered obsolete for combat, such as the B-26 Marauder, which is shown in this photo, and they also used the A-24 dive bomber. Since men were needed for combat service, women Air Force service pilots were often used for such training missions. The WASP mainly ferried planes from assembly factories to points of embarkation on each coast, but many of them also flew target tugs for anti-aircraft training at several training centers around the country. So towing a target behind a plane while trainees on the ground shot at it was obviously very dangerous. And there were accounts of gunfire hitting the plane itself. And at Point Montara, these accounts even included a few men firing at the planes purposely, presumably out of boredom or mischief. So fortunately though, the first target drone aircraft, the Culver PQ-14, which was designated as the Turkey by the Navy, was introduced in 1942, and that allowed for target towing to be phased out. So these drones were usually brightly colored for easy viewing, and would be controlled remotely by radio signals. And although they're very small, the PQ-14 drones were modified by the military to allow a pilot to ferry them between locations, as indicated in this photo right here. Okay, so however, when they were always flown remotely as drones for target practice and controlled from the air by motherships. And the WASP flew those motherships. So the mothership was usually a modified twin-engine Beechcraft C-45, like the one shown in the upper photo, and or a Cessna UC-78. And note that there's no pilot in the PQ-14 here that's being controlled by the mothership. Okay, so at Point Montara, the WASP flew UC-78 motherships from the Moss Beach Military Airstrip, which is now the Half Moon Bay Airport. The pilot of the mothership would fly high above the target area to avoid fire that was directed at the PQ-14, while the WASP co-pilot in the same mothership would remotely control the Culver PQ-14 drone for target practice. Now, the radio control station that was used for this, which is shown here, actually featured what was at the time a top secret television monitor. Because remember, this is the early 40s, television wasn't really known generally then. So they had a camera mounted outside of the plane so that the pilot, while controlling the PQ-14 with controls, could actually see the plane below and control it much better. So although flying a mothership was not as risky as towing a target, it was still very dangerous. And a few times during artillery practice, the gunners mistook the mothership for the target plane and shot at that. It's kind of odd, but it happened. In one such account, WASP Shirley Thackara, who's shown in the bottom right photo, she was stationed actually at the Moss Beach Airstrip, and she said, and I quote, "We got very angry at being fired at naturally," unquote, and she recalls one time buzzing the Point Montara gun recruit in retaliation. However, there are no official records of planes being shot down at Point Montara or pilots being killed. And of the 38 WASPs that were killed in the U.S. during World War II, 11 are listed as training accidents with no details provided. So, because the WASPs were not considered military under the existing guidelines, a fallen WASP was sent home at family expense without traditional military honors or note of heroism. The Army would not even allow the U.S. flag to be placed on the coffin of the fallen WASP. Our military was indeed slow in recognizing the bravery and sacrifice of these pioneering female pilots who served at Point Montara and other locations, risking their lives to train our sailors and ultimately enabling us to win the war. The WASPs were finally recognized as veterans in 1977. They were awarded the World War II Victory Medal in 1984 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. However, they still weren't allowed burial honors at Arlington National Cemetery until just about a year and a half ago. Despite this, there's no question that, as June Morale stated, the local historian, women flying military planes was groundbreaking. And the use of women for training at Point Montara was indeed progressive and historically significant. So, fortunately, during the war, the introduction of and use of smaller, model-sized radio-controlled drone aircraft allowed for reduction in the dangerous practice of towing targets or flying a mothership near the target area. These model aircraft were dubbed Target Drone Dennies, or TDDs, by the Navy. At this facility, these drones were housed in the TDD hangar that I showed you earlier on the map. Denny refers to Hollywood film star Reginald Denny, who's shown in the left photo. He owned the radio plane company who supplied these drones to the military. The earliest model, the TDD-1, which is shown on the right, was a simple aircraft powered by a two-cylinder, two-cycle piston engine, providing 6 horsepower and driving 2 contra-rotating propellers. It was about 8 feet long, had a wingspan of about 12 feet, and weighed about 100 pounds. Launching was by a catapult, and it was controlled from the ground via radio signals using a beatbox, which you see Reginald Denny holding here. And the drones were better practice targets than towed targets these because they looked like real aircraft, they sounded like aircraft, and they flew like full-size aircraft. They could even simulate attack maneuvers. So the Navy versions had no landing gear, they were launched, but if they were missed during target practice, they were recovered by parachute. So there's also, I don't know how many of you have ever gone over to the Montara Water Sanitary District property. It is restricted, but you can get permission to go in there. There's a sloped path down to the ocean between 2 cliffs near the south end of that property, and there's stainless steel posts with holes in them, which it's kind of hard to see in this photograph. Now, nobody really knows what these were for, but based on a lot of things that I've read, there was also a lot of concrete poured in the bottom. It appears that this may have been used for beach landings. There are accounts of the Navy facility also being used to practice beach landings, and that may have occurred here. Alternatively, or in addition, they may have been where small boats were launched to recover the undamaged TDDs that were shot down. So recovering these TDDs was dangerous work, and in one account published in the Oakland Tribune in early 1946, a sailor lost his life in such an attempt. So these early drones and improved variants made by the radio plane company were also used on some ships for target practice, as indicated here. The TDD-2, the second model in the right photo, which had only one propeller instead of two, became the most widely used target aircraft in U.S. service, with over 9,400 of them being built during World War II. And here's an interesting side note. The radio plane company, like many U.S. companies that participated in the war effort, hired women to work in their factories, and various agencies of the military would often visit these companies to promote the importance of women war workers. And this is just a few of the posters of the different advertising promotions that they had at that time. The most well-known, of course, is Rosie the Riveter. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this. This was in the Saturday Evening Post in 1943. It's a drawing by Norman Rockwell. And this is actually the real Rosie the Riveter. Now this one right here is the one that everybody associates with that. But it turns out this was little known during the war. It was actually a poster that was used exclusively by the Westinghouse Corporation to motivate their workers. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1980s, and has since become the symbol of women in the workplace. So, Ronald Reagan, how about that? In 1945, Captain Ronald Reagan of the 1st Motion Picture Unit of the U.S. Army Air Force sent a photographer named David Conover to the radio plane company in Van Nuys, California, to take pictures of female workers there, again as part of this promotion. So although Ronald Reagan was an acting buddy of Reginald Denny, the factory owner, it's uncertain if their acquaintance precipitated this visit. So anyway, this particular photo, the one on the right, shows a young woman named Norma Jean Doherty, who was one of the assemblers at that plant. And here she's seen holding a propeller of a TDD-2. Now, the photographer who took these pictures was very impressed by Norma Jean's natural beauty and convinced her to pursue a modeling career, which ultimately led to an acting career for which Norma Jean dyed her hair blonde and changed her name to Marilyn Monroe.
Oh my goodness.
There's lots of interesting history that's connected to this thing. So the radio plane, oops, went too far. The radio plane company made over 15,000 TDDs of various models for the Army and Navy during World War II. It's not surprising that most of these drones were destroyed in target practice, and just a few of them survive today in a few museums across the country, like this one in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. And use of these drones at Point Montara was yet another progressive tactic which underscores the historical significance of the Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center. So anti-aircraft training at Point Montara was very intense. It usually took between 3 and 6 days, and usually focused on a specific weapon system for each individual, depending on their current or subsequent assignments. It wasn't long before many of these men would use this training in actual combat. These photos show a row of 20mm Ehrlichon cannons on USS Hornet in 1945 on the left, and the one on the right shows a kamikaze attack on the USS Yorktown. The USS Yorktown was actually destroyed in the Battle of Midway in 1942. In the next few slides, I will present a few more details on the types of weapon systems and fire control systems that these men trained on. So the guns at Point Montara included, from north to south, a row of 20mm Ehrlichon cannons. There was some 40mm Bofor cannons. There was one 1.1-inch gun, a few 50 caliber guns. These were mostly considered obsolete, except by at least by the Navy or as anti-aircraft weapons after World War II, but they still trained on them. There were some more 20mm mounts, some more 40mm cannons, and then the big guns were on the south end of the property. There were three 3-inch naval guns and 4 of the big 5-inch guns that you see on Navy ships. So these guns and their mounts and fire control system components were typically built by U.S. car manufacturers, such as Chrysler and Ford, who had converted large portions of their manufacturing facilities to support the war effort. And two of the large turrets for the fire control systems for the 5-inch guns shown here and here are actually still visible on the south end of the property. If you walk by that fence going past the property, you'll see some rusted out large turrets on the top of some concrete bunkers. That's what those were. So in the next few slides, oh, I'm sorry, the turrets and ammunition bunkers for guns 15 through 18, shown right here, those are also still present. And if you get a tour of that property, you can see those close up. They're actually pretty cool. So let me talk about the specific weapons here. First of all, starting with the 20mm Oerlikon cannon. This is actually a pretty significant weapon. It was known at the time as a kamikaze killer. And it's one of the most widely used anti-aircraft weapons of World War II. They had 60-round magazines, which is shown right here, and they could fire at up to 450 rounds per minute. That's pretty fast. So they provided an increase in firepower over 50 caliber machine guns, which had been used previously, but they did have some problems with ammunition jamming. So during World War II, there were twin and quadruple Oerlikon mounts were developed for Army and Navy use, and they were installed aboard U.S. Navy ships beginning in 1942. And I want to play this to show you what it sounds like. Pretty cool. It's louder than I thought it would be, sorry.
That was effective.
So these photos, which were taken at Point Montara on June 3rd, 1943, show men training on the 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The photo on the right even captures a tracer round as it leaves the barrel of the gun. Now, although this gun was known as the kamikaze killer, it was eventually abandoned as a major anti-aircraft weapon because it really didn't have stopping power against heavy aircraft or against kamikaze attacks. It was largely superseded by the Brookhart 40mm gun and also the 3-inch naval guns. So, but here's a comparison of the bullet size for these different weapons. That number is wrong. So, actually, a 50 caliber bullet is shown next to it for comparison. You can see how much bigger it is than that. 20 millimeters is approximately 3/4 of an inch. So that's actually the width or the diameter of the projectile itself, or the gun barrel as well. So a live round is over 7 inches long and it weighs about 8.5 ounces. That's a big bullet, but they get bigger. So introducing the Beaufort 40mm cannon. Now this gun was the most effective anti-aircraft weapon used during World War II. It was responsible for over 1/3 of all enemy aircraft downings. It could fire in semi-automatic or automatic mode at over 120 rounds a minute. They were made in single, twin, and quad mounts, as shown here. And I have an audio of that as well. These are just semi-automatic modes. So given So I have another slide of the men training on these weapons. So this photo was taken at Point Montara again on June 3rd, 1943. And it shows men training on this 40mm Beaufort, where actually one of the barrels had been removed for repair. Given the perspective shown in this photo, it actually is at platform position number 14, and that's one of the ones I previously mentioned that you can still see there. So the Beaufort weapon, the projectile width actually is 40mm, so it's about 1.5 inches. The total length of the live round is about 18 inches, and it weighs about 5 pounds. And it's shown in the right picture compared to what's called a 2-pounder pom-pom, and that was the predecessor of this gun, so it was already quite a bit bigger. And I actually brought today a spent round from a 40mm Beaufort right here. I want to pass that around so you can take a look at that. Imagine those coming at you at 120 rounds a minute. That's pretty scary. So, and also on the left it shows that these actually came in 4-round clips. So you can see in this photo aboard the USS Hornet, where this is a live-action shot, which was actually taken from the USS Hornet on February 16, 1945 during an attack on Tokyo. And you can see how they're actually loading the 4-round clips into the Beaufort brig.
Wow.
Now, also, naval ships, many of the ships that use these guns were responsible, again, as I said, for downing about 33% of all the total anti-aircraft victories. However, it still required an average of over 1,300 rounds per kill, so those planes move pretty fast, even as effective as these guns were. So next I want to talk about the 3-inch naval guns. These were typical on Navy and Merchant Marine ships, even prior to World War II. 38 caliber guns were used in World War I even, but many were replaced with 50 caliber guns during World War II. And I also have an audio of this gun. Oops. That doesn't sound as loud as you want. Okay, so these photos show a single mount 3-inch 50 caliber gun on USS Slater in 1944. These guns were frequently used on twin and quad mounts. And each round of the projectile had a width of 3 inches, was almost 3 feet long, and weighed up to 24 pounds, depending on the load and type of fuse that was used. And now the largest guns that they had here, Point Montara, were the 5-inch 38 caliber guns. So these were the big Navy guns. They were also mounted on a very large number of U.S. Navy ships in World War II. Many of them served a dual purpose as both an anti-aircraft weapon and as a surface weapon against enemy ships in shore positions. It could fire a nominal rate of 15 rounds per minute and was considered by naval historians to be the best dual-purpose intermediate caliber weapon used. Available on both single and twin mounts. Open mounts were hand-loaded, while closed mounts hoisted the ammo from below, as shown in this photograph. And depending on the mount, a 5-inch 38 caliber gun can have a crew of 15 to 27 personnel in the gun room and upper handling room. And I also have an audio of this. And if you listen very carefully here, you can even hear the sound of the shell being projected from this chute right here. So let's listen to that one. So the 5-inch 38 caliber gun was even considered iconic, as indicated on this Navy recruiting poster from 1942, "Man the guns, join the Navy." Now normally each round came in 2 pieces, a projectile and a powder case, that were loaded separately during manual operation. And each assembled round had a projectile width of 5 inches, was about 4 feet long, and weighed over 50 pounds, depending on the load and type of fuse that was used. But this guy looks like he could toss these around all day long. So, perhaps more important to the war effort than the guns themselves were the gunfire control systems that were used. Such systems were employed well before World War II to centrally control the ship's guns. The Mark 37 Director was introduced by the Royal Navy in 1912 and was typically used by all navies during World War II. It was mounted atop the pilot house on a steel cylinder 9 feet in diameter and provided for accurate and coordinated firing of both 3-inch and 5-inch guns against surface and air targets. The original Mark 37 Director, which is shown in this photo, operated with a staff of 7 using optical sighting of targets. Later, they added the Ford Mark I analog computer in 1935, which would allow for continual estimating range and height changes for aircraft moving at over 400 miles an hour. These computers contained approximately 20 servo mechanisms or power drives for accurate position control, allowing the guns to automatically steer to the rangekeeper's computer director. The addition of radar tracking to the system by the U.S. and its allies during World War II greatly improved gunfire control system accuracy and it allowed for use during poor weather and at night. The Axis powers never really mastered the use of radar during the war, and so this gave the Allies a significant advantage. In addition to radar, many other advances in weapon systems and technologies introduced during World War II improved the accuracy and effectiveness of anti-aircraft weapons, and these advances had a significant impact on the outcome of the war. One such advance, introduced in 1942, was the Mark 14 gun sight. It was mounted directly on 20mm Ehrlichman cannons, as shown on the right photo, but it could also be used on Mark 51 directors for 1.1 inch and 40mm guns. This gun sight contained 2 air-driven gyroscopes that moved 2 mirrors, one to pick up movements in terrain, the other to pick up movements in elevation. And the reticle pattern that you would see through the viewer reflected those mirrors in such a way that as you tracked a target and kept the reticle centered on it, you moved the gun ahead of the target by the correct lead angle. This was a pretty significant advancement. It required 2 men to operate, a gunner and a range setter. It did take a great deal of practice and teamwork, but it resulted in greatly improved effectiveness over manual target sighting. Here you can see where both the 40mm cannons were also used for this, but the Mark 51 and Mark 52 directors were mainly used to control those. That's shown on the left. You can even see the Mark 14 sight on the top of that director. These and other fire control systems were used to control and fire several guns at once. And more advanced systems, such as the updated Mark 37, which is shown in the right forward photo, used a director containing optics and radar in an armored dummy gun turret that was mounted high on the deck of the ship for optimal target viewing. The director staff would feed target data to a staff manning a manual analog computer below deck in the plotting room. The computer then fed continuous target and timing data to several deck guns for coordinated firing. And the incorporation of gyro compass and gyro level inputs also allowed for rapid ship maneuvering without sacrificing accuracy during live fire, even in rough seas. So that was a big advancement. And there were over 100 improvements to these systems during the war. This schematic shows how these were operated on ships. It's a bit difficult to see. There were typically 4 of these gunfire control system groups aboard each battleship. And since this technology was shared with our allies and the Axis powers did not have such sophisticated systems, they did provide a significant advantage in winning the war in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The complexity of these gunfire control systems attest to the in-depth training that was required at Point Montara, and the advanced technology presented there underscored the top secret status of this facility. And here we have the piece de resistance. Our French is slow, sorry. The variable time fuse, also known as the proximity fuse, was the most important anti-aircraft development during the war. Did anybody ever heard of this? Because I didn't until about 2 years ago. And along with radar, this is considered to be one of the most important contributions to winning the war. The secrecy of the development of this fuse was guarded to a similar level as the atom bomb project or the D-Day invasion. And prior to the introduction of this fuse, contact fuses and fixed time fuses were used. Contact fuses require a direct hit before the projectile would explode or detonate, and that resulted obviously in many missed targets. Fixed time fuses had to be set manually, which had the disadvantages of rapidly and constantly having to change the time settings, so that was a bit difficult too. The VT fuse, on the other hand, was basically a miniature radio transmitter, receiver, and power supply housed in the nose of the projectile. Safety features had to be built in for shipping and handling, and also they had to put a self-destruct feature in that was necessary to prevent dud fuses from falling into the hands of the enemy. Although the theory and concept of this type of fuse had been realized for many years, development and manufacture of such a fuse was considered impossible, since the electronic components of that day were considered too delicate to withstand the forces involved. For example, a 5-inch gun, the projectile leaves the barrel of the gun at 2,600 feet per second, subjecting it to approximately 20,000 G's of force, and then the barrel's rifling also spins that shell, or that projectile, at 25,000 RPMs. That's a lot of force. Anyway, to overcome this challenge, the War Department quickly recruited hundreds of scientists and engineers across the country to work on this top secret project at the beginning of the war. They were able to develop a working VT fuse prototype within 3 months via modification of miniature hearing aid tubes. And the first production models were introduced in early 1942. And here's how it works. The radio circuit's turned on by the force of firing the projectile. The transmitter sends out continuous radio waves at a fixed frequency, roughly 200 megahertz, which were reflected back from the target to the receiver at a higher frequency due to the Doppler effect. Now, we're all familiar with the Doppler effect on sound frequency as things move closer or farther away from us, and that applies to all electromagnetic and magnetic radiation. So as this projectile gets closer to the target, the radio waves reflected by the target gradually increase and come into phase with the fuse-generated signal. Once the signal strength is high enough, another tube switch is triggered, releasing the energy in a charged capacitor and thus igniting the shell. The explosion is timed to produce a large cloud of shrapnel next to or in front of the target, increasing the lethality of the projectile by 5 to 10-fold where shells continue contact fuses. And these fuses were widely distributed to the naval fleet at the end of 1942. And also, Japanese officials at that time frankly stated that American use of the VT fuses was the main reason that they resorted to suicide attacks. Although it turned out that these fuses proved to be just as effective against kamikaze planes as they were against bombers. The VT fuses were used in artillery also by the Army toward the end of the war, and their use is said to be the deciding factor in winning the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendered as a result of the terror and devastation of VT-fused projectiles exploding over their trenches. This actually ended trench warfare, this fuse. This technology was even shared with the British, who used VT fuses to neutralize German V-1 rocket attacks on England, and it's the very reason why many landmark buildings and homes in London were saved. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army and Navy had spent over $1 billion on these VT fuses, research and manufacturing, and that included the production of over 22 million models, or 22 million fuses of all different models. Germany and Japan continued to use contact and fixed-time fuses since their research into VT technology was just too far behind to be used during the war. So it's likely that training was given on all three fuse types at Point Montara. So, although this slide actually illustrates the devastation of a direct hit by a 5-inch gun, most of the planes were brought down, enemy planes were brought down by fragments of exploding shells during barrage fire by many 5-inch guns firing in the air at the same time using a Mark 37 director with radar and VT fuses. So this combination of all three of these things was devastating. This strategy was used to take out many planes at the same time, including those not always seen. In one account, in 1943, a convoy in mid-Pacific, escorted by destroyers, was attacked by 27 Japanese planes. The destroyers, firing 5-inch guns with VT fuses, shot down all 27 planes without one bomb reaching the convoy. That's pretty impressive. So overall, the defensive weapon systems that were used by the Navy and merchant marines during World War II were very effective in protecting U.S. ships. These statistics were released by the U.S. Navy after the war, indicated that approximately 36% of all attacking aircraft were shot down or destroyed, while only about 9% of U.S. ships were sunk or damaged. That means these weapon systems assisted in providing a 4-to-1 survival advantage during an enemy aircraft encounter. Considering the firepower and rapidly advancing fire control systems of the weapons used, it's not hard to see that the training, such as that provided at Point Montara, was critical to winning the war. The Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center was therefore a significant part of our national and California coastside history. In closing, I'd like to bring this training center to life with a first-hand account of an incident at Point Montara on a very special day. This account is taken from a book called Finding Shirley, and it's from a young Navy sailor named Jim Asala from Cloquet, Minnesota. Jim had just joined the Navy a few days after his 17th birthday in February 1945. After his basic training, he was sent to the Naval Training Center on Treasure Island and subsequently here to the Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center. The day in question was May 7th, 1945. Anybody know the significance of that day? May 7th, 1945? That was the day Germany surrendered. Okay. And here's Jim's account of that day at Point Montara. And I'm going to have some sound effects in the background. So he says, in the midst of anti-aircraft training one day in early May, an officer got on a megaphone and called for everyone's attention. All guns stopped. All faces turned toward him. I have an announcement, he shouted, unable to keep the joy out of his voice. President Truman has announced that the Germans have surrendered unconditionally. The long war in Europe is over. The boys shouted, hooted, jumped, and fired. Whoever had a weapon shot it. Jim was the breech man with a 5-inch gun. He grabbed the projectile off the stand, slid the shell into the gun, closed the breech block, and let it rip. Everyone seemed to be shooting. The noise was deafening. For 15 minutes, the rapid fire continued. The earth shook. Dirt and dust rose 18 inches from the ground. Empty wooden bullet boxes dropped away. Fresh boxes were opened. The excitement was sensational. Wow. As if some cosmic force demanded balance, the noisy, extreme excitement of the day was followed by silent, extreme boredom. The newly trained men were immediately sent back to Treasure Island. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions?
Wow.
What role did the Half Moon Bay Airport play?
The airport was actually built by the Army, or using contractors for the Army and for the war, actually. And it was originally, after the Japanese attack, it was part of just the coastal defense because they thought the Japanese were going to try to attack the West Coast, so they actually had built that airstrip for sending out planes to intercept Japanese planes or submarines or whatever came. And they never did, but so then later it was just used for training missions. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
The platform that you said here was for the big gun. Were the other guns went north from here?
They started right here. In
Right.
fact, when we take a break, we can go ahead and see some of the rusted out mounts for the 20mm earth guns right here on this property.
Okay, then which way did the rest of them go?
They all go that way,
Okay.
south, straight down the bluff.
Okay.
So it starts with the 20mm cannons, and the big guns are down the other end.
Okay, so this is 20mm here?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And later, like I said, we can go out and check it out. You can see some of those there. It's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yes.
When my son was 12, we sent him to France for the summer, to spend the summer with a French family. And while there, he gathered some shells that he found. I came home with this bag of shells, and one of them was about at least 8 inches. And ours is plain. That was carved all over. Beautiful. And I took it to the Half Moon Bay police, and they said it was unstable, so they were going to blow it up. Nobody carried them on the plane. Nobody said anything.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a big issue, and especially in this area, because the Army obviously used a tremendous amount of ordnance, like not only here at this training center, but all the different fortifications and facilities up and down the coast, including like Camp Montara, Camp Miramar. There were a lot of live training, live training activities up on the mountain and really all over the coast. And in fact, there was an account from 1945 or 46, right after the war. Some kids were killed here. Right here in Moss Beach. They found it was probably left over from Camp Miramar. They found something there. They took it home. They were playing with it one day, and it blew up. It killed 2 kids and injured 2 other kids pretty badly.
Yeah, he went to, he was taken to a lot of the ruins around France. And a lot of the places, the schools sent kids in buses there, and they would find these unexploded shells and we'd be maimed or killed.
Yeah.
And then one time, the side of a hill fell off. And inside the hill was a German Jeep and 2 Germans sitting up in it.
Wow.
And so France...
They weren't alive.
No. And so France gave the bodies back to Germany.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Were there a lot of barracks up at Fort Funston where the gun mounts are up there?
Barracks at Fort Funston. I'm not really sure of that. I think that was just the gunman there.
Okay.
And I don't think any men actually lived there, as far as I know.
So I have a question.
Yes.
What's that crazy thing on the side of the hill, just north of Montara, that's got all the graffiti on it? That looks like
Well, that's the little Delta Spy bunker.
Okay.
That was a fire control station.
Oh, okay.
So the men would they did have supposedly they had a gun there, but I don't think it was ever used. But the main purpose of that was the gunfire control station. So it was for sighting targets. So men would be stationed there, they would look out at the oceans, look for enemy ships, planes, whatever.
Okay.
If they saw anything, they would radio the position of whatever they saw to the guns at either Fort Funston or the ones up in Marin Headlands, Fort Conti. I'm not really sure what gun was connected to. It was probably Fort Funston. But then, based on how they sighted it in other parts of the area, they could triangulate on the target. So that's really mainly what that's for.
Great. Anything else? Well, thank you so much.
Today is June 2nd, 2018, and we're standing outside of the Point Montara Lighthouse, where we just completed docent training for the Half Moon Bay History Association. We're also standing on the site of the former Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center. This training center was operated by the U.S. Navy during World War II. The facilities here housed over 1,500 men and trained over 320,000 men on the latest technology in anti-aircraft weapons. The mount in front of me is a 20 millimeter Oerlikon mount. There were several of these along the bluffs here. There were also some 40 millimeter guns, various other weapons, and some large 3-inch and 5-inch naval guns on the other side of the facility. Now, the men that trained here, this was live fire training, and they fired at targets over the ocean. These targets could be either pulled by women Air Force service pilots, towed targets, or they could even be drones that were either controlled from a mothership or controlled by radio signals from the shore. This site was quite significant, since it definitely played a major role in training our sailors and merchant marines, enabling them to win the war in the Pacific. Again, we're standing on the site of the former Point Montara Anti-Aircraft Training Center. One of the buildings we're looking at now is magazine number 1, where some of the ammo was stored, and that building is still intact. Also further up on the hill, there was a gunfire control building. And further south, as we pan up on the hill, there was also a large barracks and several other buildings. On the far end of this facility, where the big guns were, there were also several directors and other fire control buildings and bunkers.